give us an idea of what is the overall demand for talent, given the disruption, the change, and all the growth in FinTech, if you could, Lourdes.
Yes, absolutely. At executive level, we are seeing that fintechs are seeking leaders who can drive transformation, usually strong people who with technology backgrounds or who understands very well technology. We are also having many requests from senior sales executives, people who can open new markets or who can help companies reposition or grow into existing markets. And the third area I will say is quite hot is customer experience. So we are seeing some global financial institutions that have a fintech business and they want to go from geographical to global, and it's key for them to hire senior executive who understands very well about customer experience to position themselves. Other key areas where we are seeing there is a high demand are, of course, technology, product management, and compliance and red tech. Within technology, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, data science, and user experience design probably is the most demanded at the moment.
Lourdes, that sounds very exciting. And given that you have the global focus in your practice, I'm very curious, and I told you, David and Jim, that you can't plan for this. I'm going to ask other questions than we planned, but just curious, have you seen, and I'll start with you, David, and then Jim, have you seen these areas, these trends that Lourdes is speaking of in your respective areas of practice and geography, David?
Yeah, absolutely. You see it across North America, those very same trends. One thing about FinTech, you're seeing the same dynamics across EMEA and North America, a little bit different in Latin America and Asia Pacific, but I think there's a lot of the same investors, market dynamics across EMEA and North America. And that's why it's such a global business.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And Jim, we definitely want to hear what's happening from your side of the world, from Ireland. What's happening there in the trend world?
Yeah, I mean, I would broadly agree. I think the interesting dynamics is with FinTech, one of the exciting things is about the scalability of some of the products on the one hand, but I think the flip side of that is I think the organizations who think they can cut and paste their business model into each country, I think a lot of organizations start off with that mindset and then they realize that's a recipe for failure because you need to adapt to particularly regulation, I would say, in different countries, but also different operating models in different countries and different customs and norms of let's say, your customer and your end consumer as well. So I think there's a piece here around, it's almost like the old Coke, think global, act local is kind of what's really important in FinTech.
Great advice. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Let's go to the next question here. So, David, this is for you. So what are the sectors within FinTech as you see them, and how do you describe them?
Sure. One of the larger sectors is payments, both B2B and B2C. You look at companies like Stripe and EVO Payments. So that's one of the more well-established sectors within FinTech. The other is digital banking, lending. They have both B2B and B2C, but the consumer-focused ones spend a lot of money in advertising, so their brands have become kind of household names, Lending Club, Affirm, Wallet Hub. So I think most people are very familiar with those. Then you have InsurTech, which is highly fragmented, but it's trying to revolutionize the insurance industry. And every aspect of insurance you can think of, there are some companies out there trying to address and change that market. Rate tech, and that's kind of getting back to what Jim had said, these are companies that are using AI and technology to help companies understand and manage compliance and regulatory issues. Because this is a global business, but financial services has always been highly regulated. So you have the EU, which is much more progressive with establishing regulations. And then in the US, you have federal, state, municipality level regulations. And it's incredibly complex and hard, especially for startup and emerging companies, to manage through this regulatory process. So you have reg tech companies, then you also have crypto and blockchain companies that, you know, have gotten a lot of press, some good, some not so good, but I think they're part of the future moving forward as well. So those are kind of the sector buckets. The other way of looking at this as companies scale, you have the early stage companies. They've gotten A or B round financing. Most of their hires are technology, trying to really improve and develop their technology platform, as well as shape the business model. They then go get a C or follow-on rounds of capital to help them launch the commercial product, whatever that might be. Then they have the publicly traded companies. And the ones that I think kind of fall a little bit under the radar is all large financial service companies have in-house FinTech business units or incubators that are getting a lot of traction, a lot of headcount growth. And so those are kind of the broad sectors as I would describe the FinTech market.
Wonderful. That's quite exciting. And what sort of came to mind, again, another question that we didn't plan for, based on your answer, David, is, you know, with this growth in-house and then the growth in startup, let's say, you know, incubators, do you see more on one side than the other, or is the talent pretty much dispersed? And I'll ask you, Jim, that actually, you know, are you seeing, just based on what David had said?
Yeah, I think there's been more. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think what's converging here is you've got tech companies where other tech, let's say not necessarily FinTech, coming into that space. You got banks moving into the FinTech because they know they need to, right? Or into a space that's it's competitive, or partnering with FinTechs. And then you've certainly got these kind of often more niche kind of startup, private investor kind of vehicles. And we'll talk, I think, about this later, but oftentimes they're quite culturally different. I mean, my sense is probably that the fit for purpose kind of tech companies that, you know, really understand and are focused on FinTech, that's been the growth area. I think others dipping in and out of the space, I think we've seen people come and go and not necessarily stick with the program. I think the banks piece, I think for some of the banks, one of the challenges is they've got to decide are they serious about it or not. So they tend to dabble, have some units, but sometimes when you talk to the people in those units, they're maybe not prioritized. So again, it comes back down to, are they serious? Are they putting the real investment and money? And are they agile enough to actually compete with some of their, I suppose you say, their dedicated competitors?
Sure. Dedication takes a lot in this market, given all the disruption that you talk about. I'm going to do a follow-up question now from our agenda. So, Jim, to follow, what would you say are the big picture trends that you've seen over the last few years? You know, we're talking like freezes, downsizing, virtual work, as an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the first one to highlight is the impact of regulation. I think that's really big. I mean, David talked about payments, and payments is undoubtedly the biggest sector within FinTech, I would say. And, you know, that is mostly a pretty heavy regulated space. And in fact, if anything, it's more heavily regulated now than it was in the past. So, and I think people need to people maybe coming from adjacent areas need to understand that. And what does that mean? Because you're not only being selected by a company, in many cases, you've got to be pre-approved by the regulator as well. You know, and that can be a very exacting approval process. It can be slow, and frankly, some people don't get through it, so they aren't approved ultimately. So I think that's definitely one where people need to understand what's involved from the company side and from the individual side, and they need to really consider that and be realistic around whether or not they can be approved for some of these roles. I think another trend line, certainly in a European context, is the whole issue around Brexit and the fact that London has been utterly dominant in most of the subsectors of fintech in the European context historically, but with Brexit, that is a real challenge now. So for most of the fintechs who are operating on a kind of a pan-European or multi-market basis, they need an office in the EU. And frankly, that's one of the reasons we've become more involved in fintech over the last few years, is that a lot of those organizations are choosing Dublin as a base for some of that. But you also see Amsterdam and some of the smaller jurisdictions like Malta, Lithuania, and places like that as well. But that's huge, and therefore you're either moving your business, which is rare. Some of the early stages have moved location. If not, what you're doing is very much creating some other hub or dual hub kind of activity, and that's been a very complex piece, I think, for many organizations. And then I think you mentioned virtual working. We have actually one fintech client that has completely got rid of their office. They don't feel they need an office anymore. They have a little bit of space that they kind of subrent in a WeWork, and they bring people together on a regular basis for certain meetings and town halls in venues, but they actually feel they don't need an office anymore. So I definitely think with some of the smaller scale fintechs that's potentially a trend that you're going to see more of, because people are geographically going dispersed, etc.
Incredible. Those are major trends. And, thank you for starting off with the regulatory trends and challenges. So we're going to go to the next question. And actually, David, I do have you here to weigh in here. Can I get you to weigh in a little bit on the big picture trends? I don't want to pass.
Sure. I think one of the trends I've noticed over the last, say, 2-3 years is this consolidation going on, especially in some sectors like insurtech and payments, where companies came to market focused on a very specific niche, and they're now consolidating to try to build up some scale, in part because they underappreciated the regulatory complexity of entering these markets. And so they're trying to scale up through M&A activity to get to that scale, to be able to handle the complexity of the regulations, capital requirements, and all the other issues that affect all aspects of financial services.
Yes, that totally makes sense. And just on a related point, do you, from the executive search side, do you see that sort of following as well? Global firms versus boutique firms working in and out of fintech. Do you think it's more of a global firm approach than a smaller firm approach? Just very curious.
I think it impacts the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
And obviously the global firms have to deal with larger, more complex challenges, but the boutique firms are just as active, just as dynamic, and sometimes they have the ability to pivot a little more at a quicker pace. They're more nimble.
Yes.
And so it's but it impacts the full spectrum.
Thank you, David. And Lourdes, I don't know if you have if you'd like to add in, and then we're going to go to Jim right after.
Yes, very quickly. I mean, for the trends I've seen, that really depends on the geographical area. So we have been seeing in Europe and the US slow down in fintech investments. So big projects that maybe get stopped. Some companies have been merging, and so things have not been like so quickly or growing so much as previously. And we're seeing lots of growth in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Especially Asia is amazing. They have some projects that they're doing pretty well and growing very quickly and coming into Europe and the US. Yes, and going further, just talking about startup companies, fintechs, and more traditional financial institutions, we are seeing that before it seems there was a war, so a competition between them, and now there is collaboration. So they just want to collaborate, to work together. So I think that's going to be the trend for future.
That makes sense. Where there's complexity, there comes collaboration, because people ultimately want to help each other and they want to help themselves. And collaboration is one of the better ways to do that. So we're going to end this section with you, Jim. And, so we've been talking about all of these trends, these big picture trends. What's your thought, if you could, crystal ball, How do you see these evolving, these trends, any one of them, over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're going to have to see is more diversity of experience in the talent base, because I think one of the challenges is that fintechs, to a certain, or certain types of fintechs companies anyway, it's very much recruitment from within the sector. And I think the overall reality is the overall pool is growing. There's more players, there's more activity, there's more complexity. I think David did a great job of just explaining all the different tiers and sectors. And frankly, in some geographies, there just isn't a big fintech talent pool. So I think at 10,000 feet, there needs to be more of a diversification of the talent base. I think the challenge with that is, I think, the cautiousness of some of the organizations involved in that, doing that in the first place, and definitely, as I mentioned earlier, the regulator piece, because I think in many cases the regulators are not, they're not hugely on board with that. They really want to see some of that hardcore experience, and I suppose I understand that in the context that some of the work involved is quite technical and specific, and therefore they want to make sure that they're de-risking. They're de-risking the sector and making sure that people are genuinely qualified and capable of doing, particularly these kind of C-suite kind of jobs, I would say. So that's, I think there's a dichotomy in there. I think another trend item, which we didn't touch upon today, but I think to a certain degree, you mentioned it's a hot area. Compensation has been was exceptionally hot, I think, at a point in time. That's probably cooled a small bit lately, but I think that could moderate further, because I think at the end of the day, that's the whole supply-demand dynamics of it. I think there needs to be some. I've certainly said to clients, look, if you can look wider in financial services for certain types of roles, I think value for money can be obtained easier with people who have read across skills in certain types.